Since 1971, the United States has been involved in the so-called war on drugs as a response to the growing international concern with drug abuse and addiction. Since then, thousands of people have been arrested for non-violent drug-related offenses costing taxpayers billions of dollars. It's also interesting to note that since 2006, the recent war on drugs in Mexico has resulted in over 100,000 deaths. With so much money and so many lives at stake, decriminalization has become an increasingly global trend. Dozens of nations have made the step to decriminalize, and some areas of the world, such as the Netherlands, Uruguay, and now 4 U.S. states have even gone as far to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. I personally believe that drugs should be decriminalized in the United States to reduce taxpayer money, hinder the spread of intravenous complications, and limit the amount of incarcerated people. Though this idea may seem radical on the cover, it's more realistic than you'd think. Drugs have been consumed for religious, medical, and therapeutic purposes since the beginning of time. The first recorded prohibition of drugs began in the 7th century under Islamic Sharia law, which can be attributed to anti-drug passages in the Holy Quran. Soon after, many Asian cultures began adopting similar restrictions on opium. But due to political pressure by the British government and high demand for Oriental goods, thousands of Chinese natives were forced into opium consumption, continuing the mass addiction problem. The first anti-drug laws in the United States originated in San Francisco during the infamous Gold Rush era. Thousands of Chinese immigrants left their homes in search of riches, but were unable to leave their addictions behind, resulting in the introduction of opium to the U.S. West Coast. In an effort to curb the epidemic, San Francisco policymakers outlawed opium dens, yet the problem with drugs in San Francisco was still very apparent. Then, of course, in the 1920s, we have the famous banning of America's favorite drug, alcohol. It's interesting to note that the prohibition didn't make obtaining alcohol any more difficult. That's apparent by the amount of bootleggers and speakeasies. But instead, the law made drinking exponentially more dangerous. The prohibition led to the creation of organized crime referred to as the mob, which used fear and illegal alcohol to generate millions of dollars. After much political pressure, politicians were forced to pass the 21st Amendment, which allowed the sale of alcohol to continue once more under the state's control.
Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The introduction of psychedelic drugs in the middle of the 20th century only furthered the interest of politicians in outlawing drugs. With drug use on the rise, President Nixon passed the Controlled Substance Act, creating the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, and most infamously, in 1971, declared war on drugs, which he referred to as public enemy number one. Since Nixon, presidents and politicians alike have continually increased funding for the fight to stop the production and consumption of illicit substances. But is all that money worth the result? The biggest argument against drugs is that they have addictive qualities, but the same can be said about almost any activity that stimulates neurons in the brain. Gambling, sex, and even the internet are just a few of America's biggest addictions. Many even argue that addiction is a natural part of the development process. And although these specific addictions may not be detrimental to your health, alcohol, cigarettes, and caffeine are, yet they are still legal with appropriate monitoring laws. With 66% of drug offenders returning to prison for the same crime within 3 years, it's obvious that fighting addiction by throwing people in jail is not effective. So why do we continue to follow the crime and punishment ideology of the 60s and the 70s? Instead of jail time, wouldn't rehabilitation or treatment be a more effective alternative? If we as a society actually want to curb the threat of drug abuse, why spend billions to punish addicts when instead we can invest into rehabilitation? If we decriminalize drugs, those caught in the possession should not be let go, but be required to take part in a certified addiction combating program. This concept alone would reduce the amount of incarcerated people greatly and also combat drug abuse as a whole. Still want proof that decriminalization is worth it? Let's look at Portugal, a Western European country whose government enacted a comprehensive decriminalization model in 2001. Portugal provides extensive reason for why a nation struggling with drug abuse should do the same. With the new policy came expanded treatment and rehabilitation programs for those still overcome by drugs. Along with the clean syringe program that ended the need to recycle dirty needles came success like no other country has seen in their battle with drugs. A downward sloping drug problem began trending, and the same can be said for the rate of HIV/AIDS infections. As a nation who consistently provides better governmental policies, the United States should follow or even improve upon the laws Portugal has enacted. Not only has Portugal saved lives and reduced their incarcerated population, but they have cut down on funds spent on fighting drugs by 25%. Finally, let's observe the decrease in cigarette smokers nationally. Cigarette rates didn't reduce due to their legality, but due to the quality of information released on their danger. Cigarette companies are strictly monitored on their advertisement to reduce manipulation and to keep the statistics as devastating as they actually are. People don't smoke cigs because they trust that smoking is dangerous. By increasing the public knowledge on the actual danger of drugs, I believe a decrease in the drug abuse of the youth will onset.
It would be very difficult, if not impossible.
Whether or not you use drugs, no one can deny that too many lives are wasted at the hands of addiction and abuse. Instead of punish those who use drugs, we as a society should continually support progress in rehabilitation. That starts with decriminalization. By making rehab of drug offenders mandatory, allowing for access to clean needles, and eliminating the risk behind drug consumption, we might actually have a chance to win this so-called war on drugs.